Right now, somewhere in your body, there are fat cells that have been locked shut for months, maybe years, not because you are not trying hard enough, not because your metabolism is broken beyond repair, but because a specific molecule has been circulating in your bloodstream at levels high enough to keep the biochemical lock on every one of those fat cells engaged 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, preventing a single gram of stored fat from leaving. That molecule is insulin, and the primary thing keeping your insulin elevated, not just after meals, but chronically, between meals, during sleep, throughout the day, is sugar. Specifically, added sugar. The sucrose in your coffee, the high fructose corn syrup in the sauce on your lunch, the glucose-fructose blend in the energy bar you ate at 3 p.m. because you were tired and needed something fast. What I am about to show you is not a motivational speech about willpower. It is a biological timeline, hour by hour, starting the moment you consume your last gram of added sugar. Your body begins executing a repair and release sequence that most people have never been shown. By hour 6, the fat cell locks begin to open. By hour 12, your liver has begun its first cycle of fat export. By hour 24, growth hormone is circulating at levels that protect your muscle while targeting your fat. By day 3, the neurological cravings that have been driving your sugar consumption are measurably quieter. By day 7, your insulin sensitivity has shifted enough to fundamentally change the relationship between what you eat and where it goes. The timeline is real. The biology is documented, and it begins the moment you decide to stop. Before we start the clock, you need to understand the precise mechanism by which sugar keeps fat locked inside your fat cells. When you consume added sugar, sucrose, high fructose corn syrup, glucose, dextrose, or any of the 56 names the food industry uses, your blood glucose rises and your pancreas releases insulin. Insulin is not simply a blood sugar management hormone. It is the master metabolic switch that determines whether your body is in storage mode or release mode. When insulin is elevated, a specific enzyme called hormone-sensitive lipase, HSL, is chemically inhibited. HSL is the primary enzyme responsible for lipolysis, the release of stored triglycerides from fat cells into the bloodstream where they can be burned for fuel. No HSL activity, no fat release. The fat cell is biochemically locked. The problem sugar creates beyond a single meal is its effect on baseline insulin. Habitual high sugar consumption, particularly fructose, impairs insulin signaling through insulin resistance. As insulin resistance develops, your pancreas produces progressively more insulin to achieve the same blood glucose effect. Chronically elevated insulin maintains HSL inhibition between meals, during exercise, and during sleep. Fat accumulates because the release mechanism is permanently suppressed. When you stop consuming added sugar, you are not simply removing calories. You are removing the primary driver of the insulin elevation that is keeping your fat cells locked. And what follows is one of the most documented and most underexplained biological sequences in metabolic science. Hours 0 to 6. The clock starts now. The clock starts with your last gram of added sugar. In the first 2 to 3 hours, blood glucose from that final meal or snack is being cleared from the bloodstream. Insulin is elevated and performing its storage function. Nothing unusual. This is normal post-meal metabolism. Then, at approximately the 3 to 4 hour mark, something specific begins. The glucose from your last sugar-containing meal has been substantially absorbed. Insulin begins its decline. For habitual sugar consumers, this decline is slower than in metabolically healthy adults. The insulin response is larger and more prolonged because of the insulin resistance that has developed. But it is declining, and as it declines, the HSL inhibition begins to lift. By hour 5 to 6, insulin has dropped to a level at which partial HSL activation is occurring. The fat cells are beginning to respond to the hormonal signal that has been absent for perhaps most of the day. Fatty acids are beginning to trickle into the bloodstream from adipose tissue, not yet in the volume that produces measurable fat loss, but the lock is beginning to turn. Fatty acids are beginning to trickle into the bloodstream from adipose tissue, not yet in the volume that produces measurable fat loss, but the lock is beginning to turn. This is also the window in which ghrelin, the hunger hormone, rises to its first significant peak since the last meal. Ghrelin rises in anticipation of habitual meal timing, not in response to actual energy depletion. Ghrelin rises in anticipation of habitual meal timing, not in response to actual energy depletion. If you normally eat sugar-containing food every 3 to 4 hours, your ghrelin will rise at that interval, regardless of your actual fuel status. This habitual hunger is not your body running out of fuel. It is your body expecting the dopamine signal that sugar has been providing. Recognizing this distinction is the first practical tool the timeline gives you. The craving at hour 5 is not hunger. It is a conditioned neurological expectation. Hours 6 to 12. The transition continues. By hour 6 to 8, insulin has continued declining, and HSL activation is increasing. Free fatty acids are entering the bloodstream in measurable quantities from adipose tissue. Your liver, which has been in glucose storage mode since your last meal, has exhausted its immediate glucose supply and is beginning to shift toward fat as a primary fuel source. Between hours 8 and 12, if you have not consumed any added sugar or high glycemic carbohydrates, your liver begins a process called ketogenesis, the conversion of fatty acids into ketone bodies. Beta-hydroxybutyrate, the primary ketone, enters the bloodstream and becomes available to the brain, the heart, and skeletal muscles as an alternative fuel. The metabolic switch from glucose-dominant to fat-dominant fuel use is underway. For habitual sugar consumers making this transition for the first time or after a period of high consumption, hours 6 to 12 are typically the most uncomfortable. The brain, which has been running primarily on glucose and expecting regular dopamine stimulation from sugar, is now running on a fuel mixture it has not used recently at this proportion. Cognitive clarity may feel reduced. Energy may feel unstable. Mild headache is common, caused by the same cerebrovascular mechanism as caffeine withdrawal, as blood glucose stabilizes at a lower set point than the brain has adapted to. A 2020 study in Frontiers in Psychiatry, reviewing the neuroscience of sugar withdrawal, confirmed that the first 8 to 12 hours of sugar abstinence in habitual consumers produced withdrawal-like symptoms including mood changes, cognitive fog, and craving intensity, with all symptoms peaking in this window and beginning to resolve as ketone production increased. The discomfort is real, and it is temporary. It is the price of entry to the biology that follows. Hours 12 to 24. This is where the metabolic shift from stored sugar to stored fat burning becomes dominant. And this is where growth hormone enters the story. Growth hormone is released in pulses throughout the day, with the largest pulse during the first deep sleep cycle. In adults, its primary role is metabolic regulation. It directly stimulates HSL activity, amplifying fat cell release while protecting lean muscle from catabolism. And its secretion is inversely related to insulin. Elevated insulin suppresses growth hormone, while falling insulin allows it. Between hours 12 and 24 of sugar abstinence, insulin is at its lowest point in recent memory for a habitual consumer. The suppression of growth hormone that chronically elevated insulin was causing is lifting. A 2024 clinical trial in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism found that restricting dietary sugar for 24 hours produced a significant increase in growth hormone pulse amplitude during overnight monitoring, directly correlated with the magnitude of insulin reduction. The liver has completed its transition to fat-dominant metabolism and is producing ketones at a rate that supports full brain function. The cognitive fog of hours 6 to 12 is beginning to clear. Many people describe the subjective experience of this transition as a clearing. Not a dramatic surge of energy, but the absence of the crashes and fluctuations that sugar-driven glucose metabolism had been producing. Visceral fat, the deep abdominal fat surrounding the organs, is responding specifically to the growth hormone increase and insulin decrease. Visceral fat cells have the highest density of insulin and growth hormone receptors of any fat depot, making them the most metabolically responsive fat tissue to hormonal changes. When insulin falls and growth hormone rises, visceral fat releases its stored triglycerides more readily than subcutaneous fat. The belly fat is the first to respond. Hours 24 to 72. Between day 1 and day 3, the neurological story becomes as important as the metabolic story. And this is the part most nutritional advice ignores entirely. Dopamine, the neurotransmitter of anticipation and reward. Sugar produces dopamine release in the nucleus accumbens through the same reward circuitry that responds to addictive substances. With repeated sugar consumption, dopamine receptors downregulate. They become less sensitivities, exactly like drug tolerance. This is why sugar produces less satisfaction over time, and why the amount needed to produce the same reward response increases gradually. When sugar is removed, the dopamine system begins recalibration. A 2013 study in Neuroscience and Biobehavioral Reviews confirmed that sugar withdrawal in habitual consumers produced receptor upregulation within 48 to 72 hours, with craving intensity peaking at approximately 48 hours and declining measurably by 72 hours as receptor sensitivity began recovering. By hour 72, the craving drops from a demand the brain generates to a thought that passes. Not gone, but qualitatively different. Insulin sensitivity is measurably improved by 72 hours. A 2019 study in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition found that reducing added sugar to near zero for 72 hours produced statistically significant improvements in HOMA-IR, the homeostatic model assessment of insulin resistance in overweight adults, driven primarily by reduced hepatic insulin resistance as the liver's fructose burden was removed. Day 7. 1 week without sugar. 1 week without added sugar. The metabolic transformation has reached a fundamentally different baseline. Fasting insulin has dropped measurably. With chronically lower insulin, HSL is no longer suppressed between meals. Fat cells are releasing stored triglycerides during sleep, during the morning hours before eating, during exercise. The fat is moving, not in dramatic quantities that show immediately on a scale, but in the continuous low-level flux that over weeks and months produces the body composition changes every crash diet promises but cannot deliver, because it never addresses the insulin environment keeping fat locked. Liver fat is responding. The fructose-driving de novo lipogenesis, the conversion of sugar to liver fat, has been removed. A 2018 study in Cell Metabolism found that reducing dietary fructose for 9 days produced a 20% reduction in hepatic fat synthesis and measurable improvements in liver fat on MRI spectroscopy in overweight individuals. The liver is mobilizing its own stored lipids. Sleep quality has improved. Sugar in the evening disrupts sleep architecture by elevating insulin during early sleep, suppressing growth hormone, and blunting melatonin onset through blood glucose volatility. After 1 week of sugar abstinence, slow-wave sleep duration is increasing, growth hormone pulses are larger, and the overnight lipolysis that should be occurring during sleep is operating more effectively than it has in months. Here is the timeline your body runs when you stop eating sugar. It is not a marketing promise. It is a biological sequence that has been documented in peer-reviewed literature across metabolic science, neuroscience, hepatology, and endocrinology. Hours 0 to 6. Insulin beginning to fall. HSL inhibition beginning to lift. The fat cell locks starting to turn. Hours 6 to 12. Fatty acids entering the bloodstream. Ketogenesis beginning. Withdrawal symptoms peaking. Hours 12 to 24. Growth hormone rising. Visceral fat responding. The metabolic switch completing. Hours 24 to 72. Dopamine receptors recalibrating. Cravings measurably declining. Insulin sensitivity improving. Day 7. Fasting insulin dropped. Liver fat mobilizing. Sleep architecture normalized. Overnight lipolysis operating. Your body was designed to run this sequence. The sugar you have been consuming has been preventing it. The moment you stop, the sequence begins. It does not require caloric restriction. It does not require extreme exercise. It requires removing the one molecule that has been keeping the biological lock engaged. What has been your biggest obstacle to reducing sugar? Not quitting entirely, just reducing it. Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. Subscribe to the channel because next week we are going into the specific sugar replacement strategy the research shows works with the dopamine recalibration, not against it. And I will see you there.